Warning: the following content contains material suitable for mature audiences. Will contain strong racial language and topics.
Our native land, our native land, our native land. Hiya, hiya, our native land.
Hey everybody, Tchadas here, host of Our Native Land through CHEK Podcast Studios. We're not in Victoria. You're going to notice we have gone out of the studio once again. I'm back at the Campbell River Museum here, North Island. Thank you so much to the museum for having me here. I'm here with a very special guest, Haa'yuups, and he was born in Haa'yuups, north of Port Alberni. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology. He's a published author and educator. He's traveled to the Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of American Indian as a guest curator. He's also been a guest curator in a couple New York exhibits as well, featuring in the American Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, which is also in New York. So a fantastic resume, and we're going to talk a bit more about your life and also about the Colonialization exhibit that we are inside of here at the Campbell River Museum that you helped co-curate. So, Haa'yuups, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit more about your background. Tell me the tribe you're from and a bit about your culture and where you're from.
My community, the village you made reference to, is Haa'yuups.
Haa'yuups, yeah.
It's on the Somass River.
Okay.
In the valley just over the mountains here on the west coast.
Okay.
My father's blood comes from a place called Haa'yuups. Well, the people are Haa'yuups. The village was Tchadas. My mother comes from Haa'yuups, which is in the middle of Barclay Sound.
Okay. Fantastic. And so tell me a little bit about the history of the exhibit that we're in today. So it's the Colonialization exhibit. Tell me a bit about sort of the chronological order of how things came to be inside of this exhibit. Tell me your involvement and how you got started.
Well, I can't remember who called me. In particular, someone called me and asked if I would come and be involved, and I said, sure, I would. I'd be glad to do that. We came, and during the course of all of the working to come along with some sort of storyline, something that would render this incredibly complex time in history when Europeans landed here, and then when they began to settle, that would render that into some publicly consumable form. And in particular, I was involved in an exhibit. They wanted to talk about smallpox, and I thought a way to represent what happened. I don't know where the idea came from, but I came up with the idea of doing 100 little human figures that would each be lit with a grain of wheat light.
And that's right behind you, actually, where we're sitting.
I did not see it. But during the course of a minute, or I don't know what the time was that they had chosen, but I think it was a minute. During the course of a minute, 95 of the lights would go out, and you'd end up with only 5 little figures isolated from each other in the display, representing the 95% of people who died off in smallpox in the great smallpox epidemic of 1864. And of course there were other epidemics. I mean, there was diphtheria, there was smallpox, I think 3 waves of smallpox on the west coast. There was tuberculosis, there was polio, the common cold, syphilis, all kinds of diseases brought by Europeans that just wiped the
decimated
communities
population,
of so much of the population. And then the remaining fragment of population in 1864, 95% of that was wiped out. People often talk as though the epidemic of 1864 wiped out 95% of the population that was here prior to contact. In fact, there was a remnant of the population by 1864. 95% of that remnant was wiped out.
Wow.
So that was my concern. I remember being involved in discussions around the storyline, and at the time, I remember saying, we need to talk about racism, which is exactly what I'm saying in New York. How many years since? I don't know how many years it's been since this exhibit was done, but I thought that a real honest confrontation with the subject matter of racism would be useful. And the other thing that I remember stressing, and again, it doesn't really come out in the exhibit, but I've always thought the thing that Europeans more than anything else miss with our people is a perception of, one, the great diversity of people on the coast. You're from Hamalco, I'm from the West Coast. We have no blood ties that I know of, and very little cultural ties. People who came here very quickly adopted a language to minimize our variety, the fact that we're so diverse. And so we all get painted with this broad racist brush. Indians. And the Hamalco-ness of yourself, your ancestors, is quickly lost in that word Indian. And likewise, my identity as a Haa'yuups man or a Haa'yuups man or Haa'yuups man is lost in that word. Well, I've been very concerned that not just the diversity in our cultures in a more general way or the diversity in ourselves, but the diversity in our belief systems somewhere gets some attention. Because when we look at this beautiful pole, when we look at the implements directly behind you in the display case there, when we look at the apron just there, all of these objects, all of the masks, rattles, bowls, poles, house fronts, all of the vast variety of beautiful things that were made on the Northwest Coast, the incredible basketry from your country, just stunning things. All of those things, at some level, reflect a belief system. And the complexity of the belief systems, the individuality or diverseness or difference one from another, has never been addressed anywhere that I've seen, anywhere. And there's just this voluminous literature on Northwest Coast peoples. There's films of every description, but I have never seen that addressed.
Do you feel like this display in particular, because it was curated by Indigenous people like yourself, that you were able to make that paintbrush go away? Do you feel like that's achievable in this colonialization exhibit?
No, honestly, I don't. I can't remember. I remember raising those issues repeatedly, and I can do that today. But both here and in New York, I find that there's a language of essentialization that's employed by museums. So you take something as complicated as all of the various European nations landing on our coast. And great numbers of them did. I mean, there were French, there were English, there was Spanish, there were people from various parts of the world who came. As diverse as those people were, as diverse as the activities they were involved in coming to explore, to trade, to colonize, and to take over, to steal land and resources, as complicated as all of that process is, in a few hundred words, in a few display cases, where people are trying purposely not to upset guests, but to make exhibits inviting or entertaining or pleasing in some way or another, rather than disturbing. And it is a very disturbing history that we're talking about, the nastiness of all of that time, the nastiness of the experience of my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, who raised my mother, was the first member of my family to see a white man.
Oh.
So we're not talking ancient history.
Yeah.
The upset, the upheaval, the destruction, the shredding of people's lives isn't mentioned in the displays. The nastiness of Canadian history is hidden behind a very, very thin, and I would say transparent, veneer of niceness, nicety. And so I think Canadians pride themselves in being somewhat more civilized than Americans south of the border. They love to point at the Americans as nasty racists. Well, the recent findings in Kamloops and in Saskatchewan are just the tip. We are just now seeing
I was just going to mention that.
very tip of that iceberg, and I mean that. We are seeing the tip. And when you think about the schools as closed compounds that were fenced off, very small pieces of land, that's one story. But what was going on at the same time those schools were operating in downtown Campbell River or downtown Port Alberni? My mother came away from the schools, and I asked my mother one time, I said, "Mama, what did you do when you got out of school?" And she said, "I did what every girl of my generation did. In school, they taught us to darn stockings, to scrub floors on our hands and knees, to wash dishes, and to be obedient to white men." So she said we all went and we did housework for rich white men, doctors, lawyers, owners of big businesses, and so on. And she said, we did that so that 15 years after raising their children, they could meet us on the streets and call us squaws, or worse. My mother talked about using those skills and working for these people, and then having the husbands on Sunday mornings when their children and wives were in church, having those men proposition her with $2. "Do you want to make an extra $2? Well, I guess they thought every Indian woman was a prostitute. That history has not been told. And I maintain that there's a direct relationship between not the schools, Canadian racism, the Canadian brand of racism, Indian residential schools, the missing and murdered Indigenous Native women, and the creation of the squaw.
Do you find, because of the stories that are coming out now, are really shining light to those stories that have been kind of kept in the dark? Are you happy to see that there are more people talking about this? And there always were people talking about, but it's unfortunate to say that not everybody believed everything that was said. So what do you feel about that?
Well, that's a complicated question.
It is.
With more than one part. So I'm going to go back to the...
Absolutely. You do whatever you like. Yeah.
I'm going to go back to where you were at the beginning. And you said, do you feel that these stories are coming out of the dark and there's a bright light shining?
That would be a good summary.
So, in the beginning, I would say that there's ever more light being shone on the Indian residential school story. But Canadian racism, I haven't seen any light shone on that. I haven't seen anybody trying to define that. I haven't seen anybody trying to comprehend what's the scope of that. Not at all. So there's this light that is being shone on those institutions. And I don't think people are... I don't think they're being honest about what that is. So we're coming to understand John A. Macdonald is one of the architects of the residential school system, but he wasn't alone. John A. Macdonald had a friend who ran as a conservative for his election to be in government with him, who lost. He was called Philip Flood Daven. And shortly after his election as prime minister, Macdonald sends Daven to the United States. There's no money passed in the House of Commons. It was a private thing between John A. Macdonald and Philip Flood Daven. So he sends his would-be member of parliament, Daven, who didn't get elected, sends him to the States. He studies 12 American Indian schools. And the school he liked most was Carlisle, which over the doorway had the famous slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the child." So Daven comes back and sends this report to Macdonald, which says a number of things. One, that if we're going to have a successful school system, prior to this time, there were industrial schools, there were mission schools, there were girls' mission schools, there were boarding schools, there were all kinds of schools, day schools, where different Native peoples were being brainwashed in different ways. Now there was going to be a systematic monster created. And Daven said to Macdonald and the rest of his conservative company that, one, the school should be run by religious denominations. And I think he said, actually, various. So it wouldn't just be Catholic or...
It would be Mennonites, whatever the case.
All kinds of different people. Two, that they should take children as far from home as possible. Three, that they should keep those children for as long as possible away from their heathen parents, because when they go home in the evening from a school, they're back where they're learning this other system of believing and thinking about the world. So I mentioned that our belief systems haven't been given any attention. Those schools were aimed to destroy that, and with good reason. With good reason. They created the people we were. And I began earlier talking about these beautiful items, the poles, the feast dishes, the canoes. All of those things were made by people who believed something, who believed their place in the universe was a particular place, that the way to live among a society, their own society, had a pattern that had developed that was useful. Had a set of ethics, morals, beliefs, laws, practices that structured their activities. When we look at a stunning frontlet that's got abalone around it, that's got flicker feathers above it, that's carved out of yew wood and painted with Chinese vermilion, and is based behind with ermine skin. Those things, when we look at those things, and sea lion whiskers, and eagle down, they speak to me in one way. They say, rich. I am rich. So from my grandfather, I inherited the right to use what's called a tlachsat in our language. And as the head of my house, takish takamsat, earthquake house, I have a right to put that frontlet on and to spread eagle down during the course of a feast. A number of different kinds of feasts, whether to celebrate the birth of a baby, the loss of that baby's belly button, the first step of that baby, the changing of that baby from a child to an adult, the marriage of that baby giving birth, the seating of a chief. I mean, there are many, many reasons for giving feasts and potlatches. When we go back and we think about the beliefs that generated those things, I'm coming around to your question. I don't think any kind of a light has been shone there. So in order to talk about what these processes, the monster, the creeping monster, the racial colonial monster is doing, to shine a light on this fenced-in place called the Indian Residential School is not to capture what was going on in the country. It's to capture what was going on there. And it's interesting. I don't know what year, I think 1986, I was writing a book about Indian residential schools and their effects in my community.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Indian Residential Schools, the New Channel Experience. When I was writing that book, I had decided that a way to attack the subject was to look at all the unresolved, outstanding issues that resulted from that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So separation from home and family, separation from the community of your origin, which is very different than your home and family,
Mm-hmm.
loss of language, business like violence being used to work with children, to shape children, the process of brainwashing, the need for control in social relations, whether between parent and child or brother and sister or anyone else. All of the damage inflicted on children and the damage that they brought home to their communities, the learned behaviors and how those learned behaviors over generations have damaged our communities, essentially destroyed our communities. All of that was what I thought I would do in the first half of the book. So a child leaves their home. How does that feel to go from the place that you've only known in your life to a place where I interviewed one of my relatives, and he said he was running on a beach at a place called Haa'yuups, and he said all of a sudden he couldn't run. His feet were off the ground. And he turned and he said there was a man wearing black clothing, and he had him off the ground, and he was talking to him. He said to this boy, blah, 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 blah. And he must have said to that man, why are you doing this to me? What are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah.
And this man said, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Couldn't understand a word of English.
Yeah.
Never heard a word of English in his life.
Yeah.
He held him off the ground, and he walked him to a boat, put him on that police boat along with other children, and took him up the canal till he reached Alberni. And he said the first thing he saw was a place that's called the Somass Hotel, no longer exists, but it was right down near the waterfront where the boat landed.
Mm-hmm.
And he said there was a building that was 6 stories high. The only thing he'd ever seen in his life were the little
Houses.
shacks and
Yeah.
houses in his own community. And here was this, everybody on the boat, all of the crew members were talking to each other, mumbling to each other. And they all seemed to know and interact and to understand the mumbling that they were doing. Of course, none of the kids could. To capture that, and then food and the lack of food, the total owning of those children, the domination of their spirits, the corrupting of their own traditions and beliefs, and the naming of them. I wanted to capture that in the first half of the book to really lay out what happened in those schools. And then in the second half, to look at what can we do about, who can we hire and what experts are going to come and through formal analysis tell us a way of approaching these complex, none of that shit.
Mm-hmm.
But to look at what we can do about our problem, which I think is critically important, that we take responsibility for our problem. And I thought about such avenues of relief as counseling, therapy, healing, litigation, compensation, amends, different ways of looking at what's happened to me as a student at the school. What can I do about that? Mm-hmm. During the course of that, I was talking with one of my nieces, smart young woman, Shawnee Cassavant. And I was telling her in a general way about what I was receiving as information about people's experiences. And I told her, I said, it's like, I don't know, 80% of the people I'm talking to were sexually abused at schools. And she said, oh, that's awful. And I, interviewed people who were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And she went away. And she phoned me a couple of weeks later, and she said, Uncle Ron, you have a problem. I said, what's the matter? She said, well, the legislature in British Columbia just passed a law this morning saying anyone who knows, any adult who knows about the sexual abuse of a child and doesn't report it to authorities will themselves be susceptible to the law. So I thought, that's troubling to me. I mean, I know about an awful lot of stuff. So I called a friend of mine in Port Alberni. He was an RCMP detective, not a regular uniform dude. And he came up to my office where I was writing, and I asked him to look at the files, and I said, as you go through those files, orange is verbal abuse, red is physical abuse, green is sexual abuse, blue is ritual abuse, so on. And he started looking through the stuff. And after about 4 files, he closed the files and he said, I can't look at this stuff. He had a 13-year-old daughter who had been a victim of the same stuff. And he was very upset, obviously. Yeah. Really emotionally disturbed. And he left. He said, I'm going to make sure somebody comes to see you about this. I can't remember how long. Within a couple of weeks for sure, and probably within a week, the commanding officer of the police in Port Alberni at the time, can't remember his name either, he came. And almost from the moment he came into my office, I could smell a rat, And he looked at the files and he said, well, this is way over my head. Do you mind if I bring some people and have a meeting with you? And I said, sure. And he went away. And like I said, I just thought something stunk about this guy. So I took all of the taped interviews I had. I took the computer I was working on. I took every shred of paper in that office and moved them to a relatives of mine on the other side of the island. And some short time later, 3-4 days later, this dude called me and said, we're having a meeting at the Barclay Hotel. Can you come to this meeting? And I'm thinking, what are the RCMP doing meeting at the Barclay Hotel? Why aren't they meeting in the cop shop? Yeah. So anyway, I went down there and we talked for a while, and he said I gave these people the information, and they sent all of these people, and this lady does documentation, and that one's a forensic this, and that one's this. There's a bunch of people there. A lot of people there. After we were talking for half an hour, he said, oh, by the way, I've sent a couple of officers up to your office. They're taking your computer and your files and so on. I said, oh, yeah. And we carried on. A little while, his phone rang, and he said, oh. And then he asked me, what did you do with your stuff? I said, I'm not going to tell you. Every single person I interviewed, I asked them, do you want me to keep your words confidential between yourself and myself? Do you want me to use your words in the book I'm working on? Do you want me to put your name beside your words? Do you want me to put a 55-year-old Haa'yuups woman? How do you want me to do that? To be addressed in this situation. Do you want me not to identify you in any recognizable way other than age or school? And so different people had different ideas. Well, They said, well, what would it take for you to give us those files? And I said, it would take an agreement of every person I've interviewed that you're allowed to look at them. I collected that information under a code of confidentiality, and different with each one.